Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Just past, or it's just getting to 7, I guess. We'll get started and make sure you get out of here at a reasonable hour. My name is Kevin Butler. I'm the law director for the City of Lakewood, and it's my privilege to welcome you to our second and final Landlord Information Seminar of 2018. We actually did have an extra one this year, and you may have attended back in May, and that was just dedicated to fair housing, presented by the Housing Research Center, which is a company that, a nonprofit that we contract with to provide fair housing education to our landlords and, frankly, keep us as a city administration in line with fair housing law as well. I'm going to begin tonight by talking about our new dangerous dog law. Very briefly, I'll give you an overview of the law, and I'm going to talk about how it may impact you as landlords. But before I do that, I wanted to just bring to your attention a few items that may be of some note to you. First of all, we're going to go until about 8:30 tonight, and hopefully we can be done a little before that, provided we're not long-winded. And if that's the case, what we'll do is we'll adjourn formally at that point, and then whenever we're finished with our presentations, anyone who'd like to stick around for Q&A after that is welcome to do that. And then we'll try to keep as many of our panelists up here as we can for the balance of the evening. So from about 8:30 to 9 is when we'll stick around for some, I guess, organized Q&A from the audience. Those of you who have to leave can leave at 8:30. There are restrooms down the hallway to my left, and then take another left. I will tell you, I think if you haven't signed in, you should go out to the table in the hallway and sign in out there. There are some handouts for you at that table. I also want to just briefly go over our presentations tonight. So I'll begin with this discussion, brief discussion on the new dog law. And then we're going to hear from Director Bryce Sylvester. He's the planning director. He's going to present a development update on the city and the next iteration of our Housing Forward strategy. He's going to be followed by the mayor, Mike Summers, who's here to talk about the impact of the county, the most recent county reappraisal, property reappraisal, and some interesting notes you may take away from that. Then we're going to hear from David Oppenheimer, who is Principal Assistant Attorney General with the Ohio Attorney General's office here in Cleveland. And he's going to speak on animal advocates and how that ties into your fair housing obligations as landlords. I should say animal assistance, so that is to say assistance animals. And then finally, we're going to hear from Councilman Tristan Rader. He's an at-large councilman. He's not here yet. He's got another family obligation, but he should join us later. And he's going to talk about a piece of proposed legislation that's before City Council right now. It also deals with fair housing, and it could very well impact you. And so we thought it would be prudent to invite him to come speak on this legislation. It was his proposal. It's still winding its way through committee, so you get a sense of what that's all about. Okay, so I'll begin. And I just want to bring to your attention that back in January, the mayor's administration introduced some legislation that would have strengthened our dog law in general and also repealed the ban that had previously existed for about a decade in Lakewood on pit bull type dogs. That made its way through committee, and it was a pretty good, grueling, I'd say, discussion. And in May, council passed an ordinance that did just that. It repealed the prior ban on pit bull dogs in Lakewood, so no one's got to worry anymore about what kind of dog yours or your tenant's dogs are. But it also strengthened the overall code with respect to animals. As of May, we now have additional requirements with respect to all dogs, and all owners are obligated to follow them. Leashes can no longer be retractable, for example. They have to be no longer than 6 feet in length. There are some anti-tethering provisions. Tethering is sort of the act of leaving a dog out for maybe an extended period of time. That creates aggression in animals, we've learned over time, and can cause bites. So We've enacted new, stricter anti-tethering laws to make sure that when you have your dogs out, or your tenants have their dogs out, they're not out for too long in inclement weather, and therefore they're better behaved. We have imposed an additional or new system of classifying dogs based on their bite activity, not based on their breed. So we have now classifications of dogs called potential nuisance, nuisance, dangerous, and vicious. The latter three are the same classifications that are imposed by state law. The first one, potential nuisance dog, is a purely local classification just under our code. And it involves those dogs that really menace or threaten folks without first having bitten them, or other animals. So you may find that your tenants receive letters over time based on just the activity of these dogs. No longer would those be based on their genetic makeup or their breeds. The one thing I want to talk to you about tonight in particular is a requirement that goes into effect on the last day of September, and that is that every owner, keeper, or harborer, those are terms of art in the ordinance, every owner, keeper, or harborer of a dog in Lakewood must purchase a policy of liability insurance in an amount of at least $10,000 in coverage that would guard against dog bites or dog injuries caused by dogs. All right? We have explained now in the intervening 5 months since this ordinance went into effect. September 30 is when the insurance requirements go into effect. The rest of it went into effect back in May. But we've explained to folks that most homeowners and standard renters policies of insurance are going to give you that coverage that you need if you're a dog owner. So a lot of renters, though, you may not require them to have policies of liability insurance or policies that would cover even their possessions. You may want to rethink that strategy if you don't have those requirements in place, because now any dog owner, if you permit pets in your properties, any dog owner has got to purchase a policy of liability insurance in an amount of at least $10,000. So, what's it mean to be an owner? Well, we know what a dog owner is, right? It's the person who can claim the highest level of dominion or control over that animal. The person who's purchased the animal takes care of it on a day-to-day basis. What's a keeper? I would say that a keeper and a harborer are somewhat under Ohio law synonymous. Harborer is the term of art that I think you should pay very close attention to. A harborer of an animal is someone who has some dominion over that animal, not the same level as an owner, but has some dominion over that animal under Ohio law. And in a recent case, which I'll talk about, a Lakewood landlord, a poor Lakewood landlord by the name of Tom Wasserman, Norton Avenue. I don't mean to out him, this is all public. He was sued by the parents of a young boy who was bitten in 2016, February of 2016, by a neighboring property tenant's dog. So the young boy was playing in his yard on Norton Avenue, and he went to go see his buddy who lived on the second floor of a duplex next door. He ran up the stairs of that duplex and got to the landing by the door of the second floor unit. Door was open. Boy either entered the threshold or got to the threshold and was bitten by the neighboring tenant's dog, which happened to be a pit bull type dog that was permitted in the city because it was an assistance animal, at least told to us as to be an assistance animal. The dog caused some pretty substantial damage to the boy's face, and he was required to go through plastic surgery. He's got stitches, and so ultimately the the boy's parents sued not only the tenant, the owner of the dog, but also the landlord where the tenant lived, under a theory that the landlord was a harborer of the dog. Question in that case was whether or not the landlord was, and the landlord actually won early on in the case, got out on what's called summary judgment, an early motion to dismiss the landlord. The trial court granted that motion and said the incident occurred at the second floor apartment. It was inside the apartment. The landlord at that point wasn't harboring anything. It was just the owner's dog that caused the damage. And under Ohio law, dog bites come with what's known as strict liability. You don't have to demonstrate that the person who owned the dog or harbored it was negligent when the dog bit. You just have to show that they own the dog, and that person, therefore, is automatically going to be responsible. That's called strict liability. So, the 8th District, in an opinion that was written in January of this year, handed down a reversal of that decision by the trial judge to release Tom Wasserman from liability. The reason is the 8th District said that there was some question as to whether or not the bite actually occurred in the upstairs hallway on the landing where the dog may have emerged from the second floor apartment, or maybe whether it happened just inside that door. But there was blood that was found in the hallway. There were drops of blood. There was some question as to whether or not that blood came because the parents were carrying the boy down the stairs as he was bleeding. But in any event, the 8th District said there's enough question here as to whether or not the dog was in the hallway that we're actually we're gonna dump Tom Wasserman back into this case as a defendant, and that's what they did. The case recently settled for an undisclosed sum. We were not a party to it at the end of the case. But in any event, you ought to know that just because the dog bite occurred in a hallway of a rental unit, of a rental home, that was enough for the court to determine that the landlord of that property where the dog bite occurred was a harborer under the law of Ohio. And I've just pulled, just by way of example, this particular section, which you're going to struggle to read from that distance. The case is Wiseman versus Wasserman. It was issued earlier this year. But in any event, you need to know that if dog bites occur on your property, you are very likely going to be the target of a lawsuit if the bite occurred in some area other than just in the tenancy unit. All right? That's why this insurance requirement may be of some import to you as well, this new insurance requirement that the city is imposing. I would imagine you've all got liability insurance for your rental properties, right? But you want to make sure you talk to your agents because some of those liability policies exclude certain types of dogs. You may not know anymore because of our new breed-neutral law what kind of dog your tenant's got. Find out. Find out and make sure that that dog is covered by your liability policy, your homeowner's policy. And if it's not, because insurers still exclude certain types of dogs. We may not, but insurers will. If your dog's not covered by that insurance policy, either purchase a rider or find a carrier that will insure that animal at least to the amount of $10,000. All right? We have listed on our website in Lakewood, on onelakewood.com, under a link right at the top that's called Animals in Lakewood. We've listed those carriers that we could find, insurance carriers that we could find, that do not insure or underwrite based on a dog's breed. They themselves are breed neutral. So take a look for that resource on our website if you've got some question. The first step you may just want to take before September 30th, when this insurance requirement goes into effect, is calling your agent. Just call your agent, see what your policy might say about dogs, all right? I want to just commend that to your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions, but because we're already 15 minutes into it and my time ends right now, what I'd like to do instead is wait for the Q&A at 8:30, and then we could be a little more orderly. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I'm going to bring Bryce Sylvester up now. He's going to talk about development in Lakewood. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? Thanks for being here. And more importantly, thanks for being investors in our community. As you know, landlords and our rental population is predominantly what makes up our housing stock. It's about 54% rental in the city. And you're a big player in that number. Your investment in our housing stock provides quality housing for our citizens. And we know that you care deeply about the properties that you own, so thank you. It's a big deal to us that you care that much, and we're very happy that you're here tonight so we can talk to you a little bit. So what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about the Housing Forward strategy. I've been in this room a couple times, so you may have heard myself or the mayor talk about that, which was kicked off in about 2012. And then I want to give you sort of a broader development update. Again, you as investors in our community, I think it's important for you to see that our residential housing stock is not the only areas that are growing. We're seeing a lot of growth up and down Detroit Avenue and Madison Avenue. So I'm going to walk through just a couple of example projects tonight, try to get through it in about 20 minutes. Happy to stay for the question and answer period, and then I'll also stay afterwards if you guys have any questions. So Housing Forward 4.0 now. We are about 6 or 7 years into this strategy, which was kicked off formally in 2012. And it really was this focus around Lakewood's housing stock is treated as our economic engine. We have 2 major commercial thoroughfares in Detroit and Madison, a little bit on West 117th, and then a little industrial on Berea Road. But we are predominantly a bedroom community. And so the quality of our housing stock speaks so much to the city's vibrancy, neighborhood safety, quality of life, and it also drives the economy. People are predominantly going to work every day in Lakewood, and so there's income tax that's generated out of the properties that you own and that homeowners own in our community, which is why we treat our housing stock as our economic engine. So back in 2012, we wanted to sort of lay a strategy for how we ensure that our housing stock is in great condition. And so we started Housing Forward, and that was built on the annual housing survey, where our city officials stand in front of every 1 and 2 and 3 family building in the city. There's 13,000 of them, and we rate them on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 is a house that's in full compliance with the property maintenance and safety code. 2 is a house that maybe has some peeling paint, things that you could fix over the weekend with a trip to Home Depot. A 3 is a house that maybe needs a contractor or would take a couple weeks to improve. Think about maybe a new garage or a new porch, a new roof. An entire house needs to be painted. And a house that was rated 4 would be a house that was in significant disrepair. Combine all of those examples I just said in one property. And what that did was create focus for our department so that we weren't focused on 13,000 properties. We were just focused on the houses that were rated 3 and 4. That gets to the first point that's up on the screen, which is proactive code enforcement. This gave our team focus to spend time on properties that needed the most attention. So we started that in 2012. We resurveyed the city in 2015. And we're just about to resurvey the city for a 3rd time starting next month. A second part of the Housing Forward strategy was around resource connections. So not only do we have a code enforcement arm, but we also want to serve as resource connectors. We have some low-interest loan and grant opportunities in our department through community development block grant funding, but we also have a lot of connections to other agencies that offer financing opportunities, both from the private and public marketplace. So we want to provide opportunities for homeowners and landlords to have access to those resources. And then third was landlord training. And frankly, in 2012, that was really the initiative of what brought you here today. We wanted to create opportunities to have direct dialogue with our landlords. You guys are a significant group in our community. We also not only want you to hear from us, we want to hear from you. And so this is just one way that we're trying to do that on a regular basis. So I mentioned a little bit about the housing survey, and we wanted to touch on that tonight because starting in October, you're going to be seeing people like Michelle, who's up on the screen, walking around the streets with iPads. And what we're likely doing is assessing the properties on that scale that I talked about earlier. So we'll stand in front of every house and rate it 1, 2, 3, or 4, and that'll help provide focus for us. I talked through some of these. This is the legend that we use on the map that we'll publish. And this is a screenshot of what one neighborhood looked like back in 2015. So you'll see predominantly blues and greens, some yellows, and then there's one red on the screen up there. In 2016, I wanted to just show what the breakdown looked like. So we had about 90% of our housing stock that was rated either a 1 or a 2, and about 10% of our housing stock that was rated a 3 or a 4. So as I stated before, we go from sort of having our scope of work of 13,000 buildings, and we take it down to 1,200. For a staff in our building department of about 14 people, that's really helpful because we can sort of focus on a smaller group that has a higher impact. Back in 2012, the 3 number was about 1,500, and the number of 4s was about 50. So the numbers did go down slightly. The other trend that happened during that period, though, was that we raised our standards. So a house maybe that was teetering on a 2 or a 3 in 2012 might have been rated a 2. And then in 2016, we probably rated that house a 3 just because our inspectors started to know that it created focus, and those are the ones that we were going to go visit, and they didn't want the property to fall into more disrepair. A little bit about the resource connections after we sort of get our focus, after we get our 1,200 or so properties that we're going to focus on. There's a code enforcement component of that, but we also provide home loans and grants in specifically our department, where there are tenants in your property that qualify for low to moderate income guidelines. You may qualify for a home improvement loan or a grant. You need to redo your porch, your driveway, your garage, and you have low to moderate income tenants in your building, you should come down to see the planning department. We might be able to help with those programs. As you all have read a ton, the Lakewood housing market has been hot for the last couple of years. The median housing value is about $170,000 and has increased every year since 2011. Average duration on the market is a little over 50 days. That number is a few months old, and I think it's actually climbed a little bit, so houses aren't going as fast right now. It still remains a seller's market. And then the home improvement grants that I talked about earlier, we've done about 87 projects since 2014. And the value of those projects in total, not what we lent, but the value of those projects was a little over $1 million. The other trend that we've been tracking, and I think is really important to understand, is the permit valuations. So this is a chart that shows from 2013 what the commercial and residential permit valuations were by year. So if you go to the bottom of the chart, in 2013, we had $17 million in valuation on our commercial corridors, $11 million in residential value for a total of 28. What's interesting is that we've seen a consistent uptick. We have an asterisk next to 2015 because that was a year of the 3 new schools, so that bumped the number up a little bit, quite a bit actually. But what's really interesting is inside that residential component, you can see that gradual increase. That's your guys' kitchens. That's your baths. That's your driveways. That's your garages. We're not constructing 70 new houses a year. We're doing $10,000 improvements at a time. And you guys are the ones that are doing those quality improvements, interfacing with our building department to make our housing stock better. So those are literally thousands of projects that go into those valuations. But hopefully what you take away there is you're not alone. You're making those investments, and so are your peers. So that was a little bit on Housing Forward. I wanted to sort of switch gears and tie something that the mayor's State of the City was about this past year, which was sort of around building a resilient city. We are working towards adopting what's called a resiliency plan, and it's really focused on a comprehensive view of environmental, social, political, and economic forces, particularly that are unexpected for a city. So think of things like Superstorm Sandy. Think of things like the housing market crash in 2008. Think about things like the housing market regeneration over the last couple of years. All of the forces aren't necessarily negative. Some of the forces are very positive. But it's the cities that can recognize those as opportunities and be ready for them are the ones that are going to thrive. So these are some of the examples of topics that our resiliency plan is going to address. Things like transportation. How is an autonomous vehicle going to change the way that we move around our city? Public safety, energy reliability. Is it possible that we could completely go off the grid in a couple of years and have a solar panel system that powers an entire neighborhood? What I want to talk to you a little bit about tonight are economic and market forces through some examples that are happening right now. One of those is around the idea of new construction. People that have been in Lakewood, live in Lakewood, visit Lakewood, love the historic architecture. They love that our city has a lot of character. But there's a certain segment of the population that loves it, but doesn't want to live in it. They want to live in a new house. And that's okay. So we're working hard with our development community to propose creative new infill projects. What you're seeing up on the screen is right around the new Rockport development, which is right down the street on Detroit Avenue. We just finished up with about 51 townhomes. This project is called the Muse at Rockport. It's the last little portion of land on Fry Avenue where hopefully by the end of this year we'll be breaking ground on 9 townhomes. So there'll be 4 that front on Fry, and then, 5 that front on Fry, and then 4 that are in the rear that are sort of built as like carriage houses with front-loaded garages. So a unique site plan to address that demand for new housing in our city. Another example is a new house that we're directly involved in on Edenaola. You guys are familiar with where Blackbird is, Blackbird Baking Company at the corner of Sloan and Detroit. Right behind that on Sloan and Edenaola is this little property that the city's owned since the early 80s. We pretty much were just mowing the grass for about 30 years. So we said, all right, it's an odd-shaped lot. It had this sort of neck down near the back, but maybe created a unique opportunity for us to do an infill house. So we sent out an RFP to the developers that are building new housing stock around the region, and Dana Paul came up with a creative concept to do a first-floor master house. So off the back of this house is a full first-floor master with a master bath, master bed off the back, detached garage. And then he designed the entire property for somebody that would be in a wheelchair. So if you either have wheelchair or accessibility issues today or may have them in the future, the design of this house will now accept somebody that has that in their family for the next 50, maybe even 100 years. Another market force that we're seeing is this topic around innovation and creativity. This is an old photo of the Friedrich Moving and Storage Building up on Madison that has transitioned and formally converted into the state of Ohio's first organic distillery. Western Reserve Distillery and the Distill Table, which is the restaurant at the property, formally opened on Saturday, had the ribbon cutting this past Saturday. If you guys are thirsty or hungry after this meeting, this is where you should go. Kevin and Ann Thomas and their son have purchased the property and will run it, family-owned. Sort of fits into the whole Lakewood narrative of a small business owner kind of seeing a dream come true at this property. So if you haven't been up there, they did a great job on the build-out, and I think the first initial reviews are pretty good. Another concept around the idea of innovation and creativity is the Lakewood Food Truck Park that was recently proposed and approved by the Planning Commission and the Architectural Board of Review. This has been proposed by Dan Deegan, who owns a couple of restaurants in the city, Deegan's and Humble Wine Bar. This will be his third restaurant, so he's tripling down on his investment in Lakewood. This was a really unique concept. Dan wanted to introduce a formal opportunity to invite the food truck community into Lakewood. And so he pitched an idea at the corner of Edwards and Detroit. This is right across the street from the YMCA, right across the street from Edwards Park. He worked hard with our Planning Commission and the neighbors on Edwards to come up with a plan that can work for the neighborhood. But the idea is that food trucks will come up into that large front lawn area that I showed on that first slide each day, and you'll be able to go and sample food from a couple different food trucks. And there's a large outdoor space that sort of activates the streetscape in a unique way and should blend in nicely with the park that's right across the street. Certainly nothing that this city has seen before, so that gets into the innovation and creativity component I was talking about earlier. They'll break ground probably by the end of this year, and it'll open next year, summer or fall. It's a great question. Another market force that's interesting in a world where we probably think that all of our churches are shrinking and closing, there's an example of a church at the corner of West Clifton and Detroit, St. Peter's. This is an old photo looking into the site from Detroit. St. Peter's is making a major investment in their property. They tore down the old school building, and they're constructing a brand new school off the rear of this site, kind of right over this sight line here, and then constructing a brand new sort of community gathering space right at the corner that's going to come out in front of the church and sort of be proud of the site. One of their primary goals was to sort of activate this corner right here, and so they're hoping to hold community events with their church and sort of be proud of that corner while still preserving the beautiful church that's right on the corner. They're under construction right now. If you go over there, I believe they're pouring the foundations. Another institution that's making investments is St. Ed's. This is a photo of the west side of the property, and you would never be able to tell by this photo, but this was actually a one-story addition across that entire section. So the addition about a year ago cut right across here. And so over the past 18 months, they've added this entire second story, quietly. If you drove by the site, you probably would never know they were under construction. But they essentially made that addition to expand their entrepreneurship and innovation center for their students. So another example of not just private companies making investment in Lakewood, but also institutions. On that topic of innovation and entrepreneurship, you know, Lakewood has always been very proud of its small business owners and specifically the entrepreneur community. And just a few months ago, we were really excited to formally announce our partnership with Launch House, which has sort of been the incubator and entrepreneurship organization on the east side that hasn't shown a whole lot of love to the west side. So we wanted to bring them over here and bring their expertise to Lakewood. So we formally opened up our first sort of small incubator space. The good and bad news is that we're completely full and the space is too small already. So we're kind of already thinking about growth plans in the future. But this is just another example of sort of the entrepreneur community being really thriving in our community. Those small business owners kind of even go beyond that physical space. So Launch House is going to have an incubator space where entrepreneurs can go pitch ideas and be around other entrepreneurs. But we sort of have incubator spaces all throughout our city. You know, I sort of think about the retail store, the classic retail storefront in Lakewood being that opportunity for business owners to try something new. This is one example of those Good Kind Coffee, which is up on Madison, sort of right across the street from Barrio. Small business owner out of Oberlin, had their first coffee shop in Oberlin and was sort of kicking around Lakewood for a few years. And then found the perfect storefront that he wanted to do. They did a storefront renovation grant program, and they're performing really well up on Madison. We had no coffee shops on Madison, and then we had 5 coffee shops on Madison. So since May of 2017, there's approximately about 44 businesses that have either come into the city or gone through a major expansion. In addition to some of the private real estate investment, we're also working very closely with our city council and our community to do interesting projects like public art. We're working hard to sort of continue to make our commercial corridors interesting. We want to continue to push ourselves to make Lakewood authentic and creative. And so we launched what we're calling the LAMP program, City of Lakewood mural program, where we reimburse property owners up to $1,500 to do public art projects. So this picture is at the corner of Warren and Detroit on the east side of the property. Public art piece that turned out great. There's a public art piece at the new Premier Physicians building right next to United Methodist Church that just went up, if you haven't seen that. And we're working with the West End District and the Krivosh family to do a third one that might break ground this year. So if you're interested or know anybody that wants to do a public art project, let us know. Last one. So the last thing I wanted to touch on is the One Lakewood Place project, which is the redevelopment of the former hospital site. This photo is, imagine standing in Lakewood Center North looking down on the project at Bell and Detroit. Mixed-use development that has new retail, new office, and new residential that will likely include for rent and for sale housing product, structured parking, and then what we're most excited about is this community gathering space at the corner of Bell and Detroit. Lakewood has never really had its proper public space in its downtown district. And so this project is going to present an opportunity for us to design a space that can be really flexible for special events and be a nice space to enjoy in our downtown district. So what I'll end with is a little bit of anecdote of what I have the pleasure to hear from the development community, from property owners, people that are interested in, that are here in Lakewood or interested in being here. Lakewood's DNA makes a lot of sense to people. And the things that I hear most often are your city is dynamic, it's multimodal, it's character rich, so engaging, it's interesting, it's safe, diverse housing stock. And there's 15 more characteristics of our community. But I'll say that that DNA is so important to the authenticity of our city, and that if we continue to celebrate that DNA, I think that development's going to continue for the long term. So that's it for my section. Kev, I am sorry if I went a little bit over. Thank you, everybody, for the time. I'll stick around for some questions, too.
Thanks, Bryce. You have to apologize to the mayor, not me. He's your boss, and he will follow you. Mayor Summers.
Good evening, landlords. So you got a letter from the fiscal office of the Cuyahoga County, did you not? So let's see, where are we? There we are. So we've worked hard, actually, to stabilize housing values in Lakewood. That's been a major goal since the Great Recession in 2011. You heard our Housing Forward. We're now version 3. In some respects, we could argue we overshot the mark. But nevertheless, what we do know for sure is the number one determinant of values of your house are the 8 across the street, the 4 to the left, the 4 to the right. And Housing Forward was designed to address anything that could drag down the value and create instability on the street, which we think of as a neighborhood. So we've worked very hard, and as a consequence, we found ourselves in very unusual, rarefied air, especially for an inner ring suburb, where we were among the highest appraised growth in the county. Certainly we weren't expecting it. We have no control over that. But it's important that we spend a little time to understand what it means. So this is a map that, and hopefully you can see Lakewood in the upper left-hand portion, a little rectangular piece, and gives you a sense of how we compare in a region. Orange is less than $100,000 of real estate value. We have a little bit of orange, not much. Yellow is between 100 and 150. We have a little bit of yellow. Green, which is the dominant portion, is between 150 and 199,000. We have a lot of green. And then light blue is 200 to 300,000, and dark blue is 300 plus thousand up. We have some of each of those. So, compared to the region, we are definitely above average, no question. That's a good place, actually, for a city to be. We want to make sure that we are protecting the value of your investment, and for all the reasons you've grown to understand, we're working hard to do that. And by the way, one of the elements of all these new commercial developments is that your tenants, generally speaking, by and large, are likely to be millennials, because we are the largest population of basically 25 to 34-year-olds in the county, in Northeast Ohio for that matter, more so than even University Circle and more so than even downtown. But we know that generation in particular is looking for the kind of amenities that are showing up in spades in our town. And that allows you to be hopefully more successful at attracting and retaining good tenants. So we want you to be successful. We need you to be successful. 54% of our 30,000 housing units are rental units in Lakewood. So the rental aspect of our economy is vital. And that's what we're here talking about tonight. So here is a little closer look of Lakewood. And I don't know if you can see the numbers, but basically it gives you a little cross-section. The orange portion, Birdtown, median value. Median is a measure of central tendency, half or more, half or less, not an average, a median. So in Birdtown, actually those numbers have grown pretty substantially, but you're seeing about 86,000 or 93,000. Those are two different census tracts there. The blue along the lake, you see ranges from an average of about 300,000. The lighter blue in the slightly over 200,000 range. And the two sections along Clifton and then in the southwestern portion of the county. But by and large, the heart and soul of Lakewood is between $100,000 and $200,000 in value. And likely that's where your property is as well. Now, what that means to the other element of your cost, it's great to have your asset grow in value. That's important to your balance sheet. But what about my income statement? I now get a bill. What's that going to look like? So what I want you to do is take time to go, if you haven't already. Anybody go on to the fiscal agent's calculator and figured out the impact? All righty. So on our onelakewood.com website, in the highlight of the front page is check out the fiscal officer's property estimator. Hit that button. It will take you to the basically the fiscal officer's page where you can enter in the two numbers that you got on your mailer, what your current assessed valuation is and what the new one is. You need to make sure you pick Lakewood as the taxing district, and it will determine what likely your actual tax bill will be. So if your property went up, in this case, this was a Broccoli Avenue case, property appraisal went up 36%. Put those two numbers in, 109,000, which was the current value. The proposed value was 149. This owner was in literally cardiac arrest. And we were able to more effectively understand, well, it's not as bad as you think it is. It may not be great news, but the actual tax is likely to go up about 22%. In her case, about $800 per year, $400 per half. So oftentimes I think when I talk with citizens, and you certainly are among them, this missing piece of what the actual tax piece is likely to look like is an important element. So I want you to make sure you go to this fiscal calculator and get that number. So you're more informed as to what's actually going on. And you certainly have the right to appeal it, but you need to get hustling on that. So let's take a quick historical value. The 2007 valuations were the high water mark in the city of Lakewood. I'm going to show you a graph in a minute which tells that more successfully. And that valuation for all the property in our city was $986 million. The 2015 valuation, after the post-recession, dropped to 853, and we're now back actually to slightly above that 2,000. So we are actually in a fully recovered housing market 10 years after the Great Recession. There are a handful of communities in this region that can say they are in a fully recovered market. We are one of them. Most of this county is still in a recovery mode. And what you saw in your report was characteristic of basically a substantial increase in value over the last 3 years. And it reflects the fact that it is a seller's market. There's a lot of folks that want to be here. They want to invest here. And so it allows the prices to be bid up. And that's the experience of the hot market we have. So this is basically a 43-year view of property tax changes. And you can see basically from 1974 on your left side to about 2007, there was roughly every 3 years an 11% increase, without fail. The Great Recession comes, we took a major dip. Most communities in this region did take a dip. Some, Westlake, for example, I learned today in talking to Mayor Clough, did not decrease, but they just didn't increase as much. That was the exception. You can see that our taxes were reduced 7% in 2012 and then reduced again in 2013, and now a big jump up in proposed 2019. If you were to take that historical line and keep it on the normal trend line, you can see that we're pretty much where we historically should have been had the Great Recession not occurred. So we took a 10-year hiatus, but we are in a fully recovered market. And I would say for real estate investors, that's generally, I think, something you should view as good news. There is some tax cost implications to that, but nevertheless, I tell folks we're already actually the 7th highest property tax city in Northeast Ohio. We used to be the 4th highest, by the way. We're now the 7th highest. We're still high. And would you rather be in a high tax area with values that are not recovered, or would you rather pay slightly higher and be in a fully recovered growth value? And I think for a real estate investor, that's a sort of a complex thought, but I would say on balance, this is where we would prefer to be if we had to make the choice. We're not in control of these numbers at the city. This is all determined by the county, but we certainly need to understand the implications, certainly to the investor market such as you. So one of our goals, of course, is to create a community that is the destination to live, work, and play. And I think by and large, this is a great community where folks want to live, work, and play. And I suspect you're seeing that in your tenant quantity and quality. And if you were in a position where you wanted to sell your rental house, my guess is you could do it as well now as ever in the last 30 or 40 years. So we'll talk about this with greater questions at the end, but I wanted to give you at least a perspective on that important number. That should put us back on time, I think.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm welcoming to the lectern David Oppenheimer, who is a Principal Assistant Attorney General with the Ohio Attorney General's Office. He's based in Cleveland. He's in the Civil Rights Division. And David, with a number of colleagues around the state, practices in really a unique field, I'd say, with the Ohio Attorney General's Office. He's going to speak to you tonight about animal assistance in housing, what you should know, what you should pay attention to, and how perhaps the Attorney General's Office would occasionally be involved in a landlord-tenant relationship. David.
Good evening. As Kevin said, I am with the Ohio Attorney General's Office. And the first thing I want to do is put in a little plug. One of the services that the Attorney General's Office provides is a quarterly newsletter from the Ohio Civil Rights section, and that can be emailed. There's a sign-up sheet out there for the Civil Rights Reporter. If you put your name and your email address down, then you'll get an email with it. It includes case summaries, new developments, discussions of the commission. So if you're interested in those sorts of things, then please sign up. Now, I work for the Attorney General's Office, but my client is the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. Some of you may have encountered the commission, others perhaps not, but essentially it acts to enforce Ohio's civil rights laws. So if somebody comes in and says, hey, I feel like I was terminated because of my race, they file what's called a charge with the commission, and the commission will investigate. Or, more to the point of what you may encounter, if somebody says, I applied for housing accommodations, I applied for an apartment, and I didn't get in, and I think it's because of my family and that I had children, that's something they would file with the commission, and at that point, the commission would investigate it. Now, in the many, many years that I have done this, one area that has been absolutely consistent in terms of a high volume of charges, a high percentage of charges, has been in the area of animal assistance. And this has been absolutely consistent. And of those charges that are filed, I would say that a very high percentage of them end up being prosecuted. So this is an area that has been consistently something that we've seen. I'm going to review definitions under both federal and state law. And while there are some differences in language, they both really, in this area in particular, come to the same place. So it's not that you have to try to remember really two different standards. If you take certain actions, it's going to violate both. I'm going to discuss your obligations as landlords and what you should do if, in fact, somebody comes to you and says, hey, I have a disability and I have an animal that's necessary for that disability. What are your obligations? What are your rights? What can you ask for? What can you not ask for? Now, I do prefer to talk with people rather than at people, so if you have questions, you can feel free. If it comes to a point where I need to get through the rest of the material to keep us on time, then I may say, okay, well, hold any other questions for Q&A. But if you do have something burning as I'm going along, I do want to have some interaction. So let's start with, why is this even a thing? It's not as if this appears out of whole cloth. It follows from a basic principle that if somebody is disabled and they require an accommodation, then you, as a landlord, are required to provide an accommodation to that disabled person so they can fully use and enjoy your what are called housing accommodations. So, for example, somebody who has a mobility impairment comes in and says, I need a designated parking space close to my unit. That would be a request for an accommodation. Another example would be, I want to install grab bars in the shower of my unit. That would be a request for an accommodation. So there are a number of different kinds of accommodation requests, but of course the specific one that we're here to talk about is a request for an assistance animal. So that's kind of a subset of disability discrimination and accommodations law in general. So what is it that we're talking about? Well, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, they use the term assistance animal. And what does that mean? Well, it's an accommodation. It is not required to be individually trained. So if your idea of the response to, I have a disability and I require an animal assistant or assistance animal is, well, where's its certificate? Where was it trained? Where did it go to obedience school or whatever school? And they say, well, it didn't. If you then say, well, then forget about it, you could well be seeing me in a less positive atmosphere. It's not required to perform specific tasks. So again, if you're like, what does it do for you? Well, it helps me emotionally. If you say, well, that's nothing, again, that could be very problematic. And it's not limited to dogs. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time it is, we have seen cases involving cats. We've got a case right now involving a rabbit. We've seen all different kinds of animals involved. There was a period of time, I don't know if anybody else remembers this, but about maybe 5 to 10 years ago, there was a real movement towards miniature horses as guide animals, as opposed to dogs. And I see people shaking their heads. There were certain advantages to this, at least it was proposed. They were the same size as many dogs that were used as guide animals. They could be trained as readily. And most importantly, their lifespan was a lot greater. So if you take a dog and you have to wait until it's grown enough to be trained, then there's a period of time where it's trained in general, then it has to be matched with somebody, then it has to be trained, and the person in a sense has to be trained for that dog. that gets it to a point where between that point and where it's too elderly to continue to function, you may have like 5 or 6 good years. And then you have to have a new dog, which if anybody's had a pet that they've lost and how traumatic that's been, imagine if that animal on top of that was your constant companion and your eyes. Whereas a miniature horse who had a much greater lifespan and a much greater effective lifespan from training until being too elderly to continue, that would require less time of being replaced. That was at least the theory. I think the practicality of housing a miniature horse made it so that it really didn't work out. But if we had a miniature horse case and the person could show that, yes, it can be reasonably housed and all of that, it's not something that you could dismiss out of hand. So what exactly then is an animal assistant or an assistance animal? Put simply, it's just an animal which aids a person with a disability. Very simple definition. Now you break that up into 2 parts. The first of which is what most people think of, a service animal. And that's an animal that is specifically and individually trained to perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a physical, intellectual, psychological impairment. So, for example, a seeing eye dog, a guide dog, that would be a service animal. And that, of course, would be for somebody who's visually impaired, and that animal is going to be specifically trained. Some types of animals also assist people who have hearing impairments. They can alert the person when a phone is ringing, when somebody's knocking on the door. They can get their attention. There have been animals that assist people in terms of taking their medication. They've been specifically trained to do that. So there is a wide array of different tasks, and I'll kind of get into some of these other ones later on. Most landlords, when faced with that situation, do fine. It's not a problem. However, there is a second category, and this is what trips up most people when we get a charge. And that's an emotional support animal. And that's an animal that provides a therapeutic benefit to the individual. So if you were to take that animal in isolation and compare it to someone who has a pet, which is not protected under the law, simply something that the individual loves and cares for, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. If you took them out of the context of the individual and put them side by side, there's nothing that would tell you which would be which. So it's not the animal itself that decides that, so much as the person who has it and why they need it. And again, this is the area that trips most people up when it comes to animal assistance. We see very few, I had a guide dog and they said no. We see a lot more, I had anxiety and they said no. So let's break this down a little bit more. A service animal, they are performing tasks. Here you've got a dog carrying something. I've seen instances where people have kind of pouches that they put on their dogs, and they put items in there, as well as, like I said, guide dogs, dogs for hearing impaired individuals. So they can be the eyes, the ears, the hands, a real extension of the disabled individual. So then we get to the emotional support animal. And here we see things like somebody who may have depression, and they want and need to live independently, and they want to rent an apartment or a house from you. But their condition leaves them so debilitated that literally getting up in the morning is a struggle. They're unable to do it. But when you add in, say, a dog, what happens? Well, A, they know they have this love and support that's immediately going to be available to them. Maybe the animal comes in, licks their face, sits there, helps them that way. But one way that I've often heard it described as well is, I need to get up because this animal who depends on me needs me to. The animal that I love and that loves me needs me to get up to give him food, to walk him, to care for him, and that gets them outside their own head, gets them outside themselves, and can get them up and moving. Another instance is individuals who have, say, fibromyalgia, which, if you're not familiar with this, I recently found out that Lady Gaga has fibromyalgia, which I never would have guessed. And it's a very debilitating condition, very painful. There's often a psychological element, and I've seen questions as to whether the psychological element impacts the body and causes pain, or constantly being in pain then results in symptoms of depression and anxiety. Either way, you end up with both. And someone with fibromyalgia, again, they're not going to want to get up and moving. It's painful, it's difficult, getting started in the day, getting started and getting out of bed. But if they have that dog is going to cause them to need to get up, walk the dog, take it out, take it to a dog park, and then they're up and exercising. Even though they sure don't want to, at the same time, the fact that they need to care for this animal gives them the incentive, gives them the ability to do what's so important. Getting up and moving is so important for this condition. So if they're going to live independently, rather than have to have somebody with them and caring for them day in, day out, this animal may give them help that is simply not available any other way, through medication, through any other method that may be available. So what does the Federal Fair Housing Act tell us? And I think if you take one thing away from what I'm telling you tonight, it's really this. An assistance animal is not a pet. So if you think of it that way, that this is not a pet, if you have a no pets policy in your lease, if you have that in your housing stock, it simply doesn't apply. Rather than thinking of it as, why do I have to make an exception to my rule? It's more, my rule doesn't apply here. And if you bear that in mind, that's going to help you tremendously to follow what the law says. Because not only are we talking about a no pets policy, a direct you can't live here policy, but even things like a deposit. So many people say, look, animals cause damage, animals cause stains, so I'm going to charge more for a pet in the security deposit so I have the money to cover that. And you may say, well, that's refundable, what's the problem? However, the commission has taken the position that is not acceptable because of two reasons. If an individual is looking at renting this place and they have to put down an extra $300, $400, what have you, that may be an economic barrier to rental for them. It could happen that they can make it, but that extra amount is really going to dissuade them. And also, legally, you cannot impose extra burdens or barriers or costs, even ones that will ultimately be repaid, on an individual because they have an assistance animal. I have one attorney who's been doing this for longer than I have, who will say, think of these animals as wheelchairs with fur. They are an extension of the individual. They are necessary to the individual. And you would not charge somebody more or require them to put more money down to live there because they have a wheelchair, a walker, medication that they need to take, what have you. And so you're not going to do that for an assistance animal. So, yes. If you could stand up, it might help me hear. It's a little hard to hear from back there. I mean, I don't know those details. If it was an assistance animal, then obviously, and this is something I'll get to, but I'll discuss it now. Obviously, if the animal is a dangerous animal, then you would apply whatever rules you have regarding dangerous animals. I mean, obviously, it's highly unfortunate if it was it's terrible. It's a tragedy regardless. But if it was an actual assistance animal, then you would certainly expect that it would not be a danger to other individuals. But Right. Sure, and I'm, and we'll, all right, and I hear you. Well, I understand, and there's certainly, in terms of passing the law, enforcing the law, there's certainly a need to balance the interests. So if an animal, for example, does damage to the property, then you can follow whatever your normal procedure is for securing reimbursement for the damage that is caused. So if there's a security deposit, it can certainly be applied to that. If you have reason to believe that damage is taking place, you can take action. What you can't do is assume that there's going to be damage. You can't assume or presume that, yes, this dog is going to be dangerous. Yes, this dog is going to cause harm. I mean, for that one animal assistant in the Wasserman case, there must be, you know, hundreds of assistance animals that have done absolutely nothing wrong and have not done any damage. So because this is so critical for people who have disabilities, the determination was that, yes, they do have the right to this. And I will definitely get in a few minutes to what they have to do and what you can ask for before being required to house the animal. We've had landlords who have said, look, I asked for the necessary information and verification and didn't get it. So I will get to that in just a few minutes. So before I do, here's a question, just by a show of hands. How many people would say that of these two laws, the Fair Housing Law, which controls where you live, versus ADA, which controls where you work, eat, do things like go to the movies, which one gives an individual with a disability more rights, if you will, greater latitude? How many people would say the Fair Housing Law, by a show of hands? We've got a smattering. Then how, everybody else, is it, are you saying the ADA? How many people would say the ADA? Nope. It is the Fair Housing Law. Because the ADA only applies to service animals, not emotional support animals. So, lucky you, you have the law that provides your tenants more rights, federally at least. Now, perhaps this makes you feel better. When we get to Ohio law, guess what? We don't have service animals differentiated. There's just animal assistant. And that's defined similarly to federal law as any animal which aids the disabled. And again, no limitation as to species. Yes? Well, and again, I mean, I will get to there in just a moment. Right now, I just want to point out, if it makes you feel any better, Ohio law really does not make the same distinction as federal law. So in terms of Ohio law, you just deal with animal assistance. And again, when it comes to housing, both the state and federal law are the same. So what is it? I'm putting this under best practices, but I think this gets to the point of who makes the determination, what can we do to verify, what is it that you should do if a tenant or an applicant to be a tenant comes to you and says, I have a disability, I need this animal because of the disability. Well, the first thing that you can do is verify the disability if it's not known or obvious. Now, let's be realistic. Someone comes in and they have the dark glasses, they have the white cane, they have the guide dog. It's pretty clear that this person is visually impaired. I mean, unless you have some reason to believe, and you better be able to back that up if it's that clear, that they are not, then it's pretty clear and obvious that they have the disability and what the dog is doing. But again, when we get to these emotional support animals, it may well not be so clear. You look at the individual, you can't see a psychological condition, which cuts both ways. You can't just discount that they have one because you don't see it. I've had respondents who have done that, particularly in the employment context. I had someone who said, you look fine. I don't see why you need an accommodation. we ended up getting, a fair recovery for that individual. But what you can do then is verify the disability as well as the need for the animal and its relatedness with the tenant's medical provider. So that could be somebody's psychologist, their family practitioner, their psychiatrist. A note from a social worker can help explain the connection. If you've got a doctor's note saying, yes, this person has fibromyalgia, they suffer from soreness, they suffer from, depressive symptoms, then you get something from somebody's social worker saying, this dog is critically important for them to be able to live independently. So you can, in those instances, certainly say, I need verification that you have a disability and that the disability, in fact, does require the animal, that the animal that you are saying you need is connected to that disability. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you get the person's entire medical history. I had one landlord who went to the person's therapist and essentially said, you are going to sit down with me and we're going to have a conversation about this person. And I'm going to tell you why I don't like them and you better defend this. It's no. I provided you with the letter. I stand by the letter. I verify that the letter came from my office, certainly, and everything in it I stand by. But that doesn't throw their entire medical history open for you to demand. You can't, get a release and demand their entire medical records, their physical medical records. So what exactly is necessary is going to be, and I know this may not be the most popular answer, but it's going to be a case-by-case situation as to how much you need and whether what they provide is sufficient. And if you feel it's not, you're going to be able to need to articulate that both to the person, hey, I really need this or that additional information, and potentially to the commission as well. Yes?
Why don't you clear this all up and have anybody with disability considered retired want to rent anything, have to go through you, and you give us the letter.
There'd be no way administratively that we could keep on top of that, do that kind of evaluation, force the individual to come to our agency at any point in time. We're not the ones who vet on the front end. And that's not a legal requirement under the statute. The statute doesn't say you have to have a letter from the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. The statute says if you have a disability and the need for an accommodation, the landlord needs to provide that accommodation as long as it's not an undue burden. And again, if you have reason to believe, objective reason to believe that this dog is doing damage, that the animal, usually a dog, is dangerous, then you can take action for that. But again, we're trying to balance the interests here, and the disabled person shouldn't have to jump through unnecessary hoops to demonstrate that, yes, I'm disabled, and yes, I need this animal. And so we're trying to make sure that, yes, while you have the right to verify that, it's like saying that every assistance animal has to then have a certificate saying that they are. No, it's really a case-by-case basis. It requires flexibility on both sides. If a tenant says, I'm not going to give you that, that's too much, well, you do, as landlords, have the right to verify what they're telling you in terms of this animal. But on the other side, it shouldn't be unnecessarily difficult for them to do so. So there's no central clearinghouse that people have to come to. And honestly, I don't know that there would be the administrative ability to process every disabled person instantaneously. Then what, there's a backlog for a few months, they can't get the proper paperwork? No, if they can get that note from their doctor, they can explain why they need the dog, that's what the law requires. Yes, again? I'm sorry, could you stand? I can't. Well, so in terms of a handicap parking pass, I mean, I'm not completely familiar with the process, but I think that's a very specific kind of mobility impairment, and that is something that the state processes. The state has not created a clearinghouse for every kind of disability, be it psychological, be it physical, be it, emotional, be it visual. And so there simply is not that clearinghouse that you might like to see. And so you as landlords have to be flexible with these individuals. So I think I have time for like a couple more questions. Yes, over here. The question is, what if you have one tenant who needs the animal and another tenant who's allergic to the animal? And this, of course, is one of the most difficult situations realistically to deal with. First, you try to see if there's any way to solve it. If you have other housing stock that one of them can move into. If there's some way that they can get a hypoallergenic animal. So you work through all the possibilities. But realistically then, if there's absolutely no way around it, worst case scenario, and I know that in theory this comes up, in reality it's been a vanishingly small percentage of cases where one person has an animal and the other person can't survive that animal being in that individual's apartment or what have you. I think at that point it could come down to who was there first, because if there's literally no other option. But I hear you, and that's difficult, but it's very rare. So hopefully you can find some way around it. Yes.
I have a question for you. And, I think that most landlords really understand. One of the problems that we run into, and it's quite frustrating for us, anybody can go on the internet, anybody can go to the certificate, and then the stuff. And sometimes it's very buggy. We've done it in the office. In our office, we want in. Everybody in our office could have it.
Right, no, I hear you.
Qualify for that. And it's a very frustrating thing when you know what's happening, when you know that you're being abused. I have absolutely no problem with accommodating anybody with a disability, whether I can see it, whether I can't. I mean, you have to, that's the business.
Okay,
we're in, and that's the right thing to do.
I hear you.
I'd like to know what the Attorney General's office is doing to stop that type of activity.
So a certificate. A colleague of mine first saw this in something that was called a life hack. The first thing you have to know about those certificates is they're nothing. If this is a certificate from some unknown person online, not the person's physician, you're like, where did you get this? Online. That's insufficient. I need something from your doctor. So the certificate is not a magic piece of paper. Those certificates, honestly, there have been some steps taken to address websites that make actual false claims about what they're offering. And that certificate does not mean, if they just went online, answered some questions, and someone sent them a certificate, that's not what I said you're allowed to get, which is verification from their doctor. Medical verification about their condition and the need for the animal. Really the only use for those certificates, if somebody doesn't want to be bothered, because yes, this is an assistance animal, but people don't know it, so I put out my certificate. But as a legal matter, that's not something that you have to go, well, I'm stuck. No. Is this from your physician? I need something from your physician. I'm sorry, this certificate does not suffice.
You realize that there's a lot of doctors online or counselors that people never see that are in Nevada or wherever that are issuing stuff like this. They provide a letter with a certificate.
And is this your doctor? Is this your physician? How do you explain it? I mean, are people going, are,
Your board of our time and our energy for something like that would be quite frustrating. That's why I think you're probably a little on edge with this.
and I understand, there are always going to be people who abuse any system, and that's why we have a process where we investigate. And if the person cannot verify that this certificate is valid, that this in fact is their physician, then that's not going to stand up. But that doesn't mean you eliminate the law or your responsibilities. My time is up. We will have a Q&A session. So I do have to yield at this point. So just real quick, if you do have questions, there's both the Attorney General's Civil Rights section and the Ohio Civil Rights Commission itself.
I knew that would provoke some discussion. So once again, I remind you, at 8:30, we will formally adjourn. Those of you who need to be somewhere else may leave. Those of you who couldn't bear to miss any more of these good questions and answers, quietly, if you could, remain in your seats while those who are leaving shuffle out, and we will stick around, and then we'll take your questions as we have been thus far, and we'll all be available. I'm going to introduce Tristan Rader. He's an at-large councilman in the city of Lakewood, was elected last year. He's in his first year of office and has introduced some legislation that's currently pending before the Housing Committee of Lakewood City Council that may have an impact on some of your leasing practices. And so I just want to introduce Tristan so he can talk about it. Tristan, what I've done for you, so you know, is just call out the 3 sections of the code where this applies, and I'd be happy to just use this later or...
Sure, well done, thank you.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Now, what I've done is I've printed some packets for you. I made 20. Obviously, I was ill prepared. I didn't know how engaged our landlords were here, so you attend to this, I attend to this, I can fight over it. So, back in July, oh yeah, I'm Tristan, I'm a councilman here, newly elected. What I've done in July...
Do you want me to help you with anything?
I know, I'm okay.
Okay, do you
Yeah.
want that?
Do I need a mic? Can everyone hear me? Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
So back in July, I introduced an ordinance that would add source of income to our list of protected classifications. The package there included the ordinance. I'll be sure to produce more. Part of the reason I'm here, the most important thing, I'll keep it as short as I can so we get to Q&A, is I want to engage you, the landlords, in this process. I've spoken to many landlords about this as we move forward, but I want to get everyone involved, as many people as possible. In about a month, we're going to have our first committee meeting on this. This is not a done deal. I want to hear from you what you think
about capacity. He'll challenge, he may challenge. So what would be how should I handle this if this comes up?
Okay, Councilman, would you just mind, because this gentleman's in the front row, could you just repeat the questions if they're coming from the front?
Thank you. Thanks. He's saying that he's got a building that wouldn't pass the federal inspection. How would you then deal with that? At least that unit would need to pass that inspection in order for that tenant to be there. Now, let me just make this very clear. This is a proposed law. One of the things that landlords have, I met with a couple landlords recently, and one thing that I'm planning to do, and we're going to do the first committee meeting, they're going to come, and we're going to at least carve out duplexes that are also owner occupied, because I know that there's some financial concerns and there's some research that brought to me. So I'm willing to adapt and make some carve outs in this law. I think that's something we need to all come to the table and agree on what it's going to be at the end. I do not expect this legislation to be exactly as it is on the screen, and that's why I'm here tonight. I want you to come to this meeting, voice these concerns, and kind of hash out. These are great questions. And I'm not going to have all the answers to the questions right now, so let's keep this conversation going. And please pass these out too. This has got my contact information on it. And I know we're here now. Let me make sure I have my cards up here. So before you leave, you take my card. October 22nd at 6 p.m. in the back room is a Monday. I want everyone to be there, and I want anyone in this room to contact me to sit down and do a face-to-face meeting sometime before then. Give me your concerns. Let's see if you can't work through them.
My understanding is, as SOI, Section 8, whatever, there's no way to garnish that. So if I were to ever have God forbid, if I were to ever have a problem with a tenant that's actually working a real job, worst comes to worst, I can garnish their wages. I have other means to go after them if there's an issue. I have actually, I'm fortunate enough to get quality tenants, but I just never know, and I have no way of collecting against someone that does not work a normal job. It's unfortunate that those of us that don't live in the city, don't get to vote. This is the first time hearing this, but, I've pursued some of my properties.
And I think your SSI question and other sources of income question as it relates to other sources of federal income other than vouchers is interesting, something I hadn't thought about. And I don't know, you wouldn't have to get a better answer on that. That's a good point.
This is my understanding.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, he's correct. You can't garnish. It's there. There's a provision with CMHA, and I don't know if it's even other programs, but if your unit doesn't pass an inspection, then those days where it's not passing, you'll never get that back. They won't pay you for it. Whereas when you never, so basically the agreement that you have when you pass the overall inspection supersedes what's in your written lease between landlord and tenant. So now we can't basically agree with the tenant that they have to pay the rent and, the standard procedure where we're bad landlords that run rent escrow and things like that. Now, it doesn't pass for something as silly as, I don't know, crack a face plate on something or burn a ball or whatever, up to the sole discretion of the inspector, who we don't know how they're qualified or not. We'll never get that data of rent. And that, for running a business, we've got someone who has he really doesn't care about our business, saying, well, this doesn't pass, and by the way, I'm not going to be able to get back to inspect it until a week from Thursday, so you're going to be out of rent.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious, what's your goal? Why are you proposing this? What's the story behind this that you're... Good question, yeah. No, very good question. So, the reason why is I was approached by we got together through a couple different ways, actually. The meeting we meet with them, they approached me, the Fair Housing Center, and they mentioned this is something done in other states. New York is a source of income state, and then also Oregon. There's 5 cities here in Cuyahoga County that have already done it. Part of the reason is just to get rid of that stigma that, we're a non-section inspection city. We're not
Folks, this has been very helpful. Councilman, thanks. I do want to stick to the schedule. It does sound as if maybe for the first time ever in David Oppenheimer's career, he found a rival for quick questions from the audience. Very good questions. So we will formally adjourn. Just those of you who are leaving, please leave quietly, and then we're going to start taking questions, and I'll be right with you. Just a moment.
Daryl Curtis. Daryl, I've got a couple hundred units here in town. You look so familiar, Dan. It was good to see you. Very good to see you, my friend. Hey, how are you? It's good to see you.
No, we're going to take the questions from the seats, please. From the seats.
Good to see you.
Folks, if you have questions, I would ask that you sit. Yes, hi. Yeah, well, that's how it gets here. That's how it gets. You do a great job. Thank you. Yeah, sure. And I'm sorry I butchered your new name. It's, you know. I know. That's much easier. Hi.
I forgot to sign the paper.
Okay, we'll make sure you sign it.
Where is it?
Um,
Outside the paper,
It-
but
th-
the
They may have taken it. Here, I'm going to give you my card. You can you send me an email and say that you were here?
yeah,
And I'll,
my wife, myself, both.
that's fine. There's my card. Just send me an email. We'll add you to the list. All right, folks, we're going to start taking questions now. For those of you up at the table, I would ask that you sit or leave. Say that. Mayor, you got to get started. Bryce, we're going to start taking questions now. Thanks. Carrie, I'm sorry, we're going to start taking questions now. Thanks. Okay, let's, you've been waiting patiently in the back. Yes, sir. Oh. That's that it would just add source of income. Councilman Rader explained it, I think, adequately. Source of income is the exact term of art that Councilman Rader has proposed be added to the list of reasons landlords cannot discriminate against prospective tenants. I didn't hear that. Yeah, just 3 sections. So that's the definition of source of income in this particular proposed ordinance. And then we redefine, the proposal redefines what the word discrimination means based on source of income. And then there's a specific provision that says that landlords can't discriminate against prospective tenants based on source of income in addition to other reasons. Is that it? Is that?
Those are the 2 sections.
Okay.
You could still deny them on FICO
Oh, I just want to make sure we're addressing all the questions, that's all. So,
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. Just remember, this is one councilman, one vote. He needs 4 to pass this, 5 if there's a mayoral veto.
That's a good point. And I think that the mayor's absolutely right, and I should have mentioned this earlier. I'm one of 7. I'm bringing this up. I have some support, I know. I know that I might have to work to win some other people over, and that's, again, one of the reasons I'm here is to kind of, that's a great question. You know, what is the impact on our bottom dollar? I'm sure the mayor's thought about this, and it's something we're going to have to discuss. I'm sure he'll be at the meetings, and you should come too. Come to our committee meeting on October 22nd if that's a serious concern. Right now, we have, what, 390, something like that, voucher holders in the city?
About 350 vouchers.
350 voucher holders. So what does it mean if we double that number? Yeah. What does it mean if we double that number? You know, what does it mean on our bottom line? Maybe we should do some math. Yeah.
Started off the meeting by talking about the uptick in values and so forth, which is all great for us to hear, but we also are concerned about maintaining values. And since this has been done in other areas we talk about, you know about, there's got to be some statistics on how it affected those areas property value-wise or profit-wise, right? Have you researched that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's actually, I've not seen any data that supports the fact that it's somehow degraded neighborhoods or degraded areas that have this program. I think in Cuyahoga, it's been around since 2014. It's not been a long enough track period. I know places like Washington, maybe Carrie can speak to this deeper, and Washington, D.C.'s had this for quite a while. They're one of the pilot programs. I know they've had success with it. You know, and I do know that, I mean, so the inspection process and the level at which the government requires voucher holders or the landlords of voucher holders to keep their properties is relatively high, and they require I guess an issue, and it could be an issue, they require the properties to be inspected every single year. It's not something we can do at a city, right? You get an inspection maybe once how often does the city inspect rental properties? Every 3 years. So I mean, these properties are actually getting inspected more frequently. I would think that the standard should actually be higher. I mean, just based on that.
But just real quick, if you could put a lot of fires out if you had this information and say, look, this has been done in these 12 areas, and statistically, these 12 areas, the property values could either
I think that's a great point.
maintained the same value or went up.
Yeah.
If they went down, obviously, you have a tough argument. But
Sure.
that would be really good information to have if you're trying to push something.
And
really, before you push something like that, you should know this.
yeah, we'll work on that. Thank you. Appreciate it. Sir.
Yeah, I was going to say a couple things. One, I think from the city level, educating individual landlords about how to set minimum criteria. Income is obviously just one. There are a lot of other factors that you can set as minimum requirements to accept tenants. FICO score, debt to income ratios that are, he's just talking about income, right? And
Yeah.
accepting vouchers as income. So you can use other factors as your minimum criteria, and I would encourage the city, if this does go forward, to make this in the next landlord seminar to educate individual landlords, because I don't think they probably know that.
I think that's huge.
The second thing, I would concur with a lot of the comments. I do think this proposal does contradict a lot of the first part of this presentation. I think your comment about owner-occupied properties, though I understand that, I do think, as somebody who works for a company who's invested a lot of money in blighted properties and trying to increase
that is an interesting point. That's something I did think about. But then I also think about the fact that this is a guaranteed income. I know there are landlords that love the program and love accepting vouchers because it's something that they can just rely on. They get that check direct deposit into their account every month. So
I think what landlords like are quality tenants.
yeah, and you still have
A lot of different factors.
and you still have the tools, like you'd mentioned, to screen thoroughly your tenants. It's just I am taking one tool out of your toolbox. You know, that's just the truth. I mean, I'm proposing that. I shouldn't say I am. We have to still get together and figure out 1 of 7. There's a potential veto. So let's keep working this out. You're invited to every single meeting we ever have, and please make sure, if you're here, I'm sure we have your list and your contact information. We'll make sure we get the meetings there. Come, share your input, get a meeting with me. Let's try to work it. A couple more questions. I don't want to take too much more time.
This is for Mr. Oppenheimer.
Okay, good.
I applied for the airlines, potbelly pigs, peacocks, all sorts of stuff coming in for assisted, support animals, all that sort of stuff. Do we have any leeway of stopping a particular animal, a peacock, really?
The-
Put a peacock in one of my property?
Are you, okay, so you said airlines, and the first thing that I'll say,
Calling them support animals.
okay, well, the Peacock case, which I'm somewhat familiar with, ended up not going on the airplane. And the individual, did not do what was necessary to,
Have gone ahead and started to implement a bunch of policies.
right. And there's the Federal Air Carriers Act that applies to that, which is different. Now, a peacock, if, for a reasonable accommodation, it cannot impose an undue burden. So if the animal creates an undue burden, if you can demonstrate that it would be an undue burden, now, would a peacock, if you had a house, for example, with a yard, and the person could demonstrate that they would maintain that peacock, it wouldn't damage the property, it wouldn't put anything on you, would that automatically mean just because it's a peacock, it's an undue burden? Not necessarily. So you have to take it again on a case-by-case basis. Can they show that they need the peacock? I haven't seen that. I haven't seen where somebody has said, I need a peacock living with me. If there's some reason that they absolutely do, then again, you do have to be flexible with it. That is not something that we've seen in Ohio. So if they meet the criteria and it does not impose an undue burden, I would say that there is no real absolute rule. They have to demonstrate medically they require it, and it cannot be an undue burden on the landlord.
I have a 4-unit apartment. It's tight. People very close living in this 4-unit apartment. What recourse would I have to go ahead and protect my other 3 tenants that are in there as far as noise, as far as any of this, smell from the animal, anything like that?
Well, if you start to make assumptions, that's where you can find yourself in trouble. If you say, look, I have these concerns, can you make sure that this animal is not going to interfere with other tenants' quiet enjoyment, then they can do so. If the animal interferes with other tenants' quiet enjoyment, you can take action. I want to make sure everybody understands, disability law, discrimination law is all about not making assumptions, not just saying, can't be done. I'm going to assume this about this. It's about doing a case-by-case evaluation and analysis, being flexible, working with the person, and then if there's a problem, addressing it, and ultimately, if it can't be, and it is an undue burden, then that's your recourse to say, this did not work, you got to find another way.
So take comfort, City of Lakewood does not allow venomous snakes, leopards, tigers, a whole list of things. Yeah.
On the other hand,
I know you've been
we
waiting.
have to be serious about the case-by-case basis.
So it's the same topic. I'm curious if there's any precedent on, for the undue burden decision on breed for emotional assistance animal, specifically to the example that Kevin gave. In my mind, the biggest concern would be somebody has an emotional support animal. It's a breed that your insurance policy doesn't cover. Would undue burden cover you denying that emotional support animal or fighting that based on your insurance policy not covering that breed?
My understanding is no, that at that point, just as there is a list of insurers that do cover pit bulls, as I believe Kevin set out, that you would need to find an insurer who does cover it. What I've seen from HUD and from case law is that breed discrimination is something that really has become disfavored. And I know that insurance companies have done that, but you can't let the insurance company cause you to discriminate. So you would need to then find a carrier who does not discriminate based on breed. And I believe they are out there. Well, the landlord may have to pay the cost difference. Again, we have not seen in the case law where that, insurance coverage has been sufficient to be an undue burden.
If you have 2 or 3 applicants and one of them has an assistance animal, but you pick one of the other ones, do you have to take the assistant even if the other tenant is a better tenant as far as income, pays the rent?
No, what you're going to need to make sure you're able to do is if that person comes to my agency and says, he didn't take me because of my assistance animal, you can prove that's not true. Here were the objective criteria that I apply to everybody regardless of assistance animal. Then we'll say, okay, you did it for a legitimate non-discriminatory reason. It doesn't give them an additional right to the housing. You just can't hold it against them.
They would probably look at how you made decisions on any other units and any other applicants.
Absolutely.
First come, first serve, or highest and best, however
Right.
you look at that, they'd look at other cases.
They absolutely would. That's called comparables. And so if you say, well, I looked at the credit score, and then we'd say, oh, great, so you should be able to demonstrate you did that for other tenants, please do so. And if, in fact, that's your practice, maybe you take out certain identifying information, but you should be able to produce, yeah, on this date I had these people, and you can see I picked the person with the highest credit score. So, yeah, if you have criteria, objective criteria that you're applying across the board, you should be able to demonstrate that, and then we'll say that's not why you didn't get the property.
Ma'am, you've been very patient. Second row, go ahead.
She should have told you, but then if she says, oh, I can prove that I need this animal, sometimes people are afraid that they're going to face discrimination, so they maybe irrationally tried to kind of avoid the confrontation for as long as possible. So she should have certainly been upfront, but if upon you saying you have this animal, it's not in the lease, and she says, it is an emotional support animal, here's my verification, and it checks out, then she has the right to keep it.
But doesn't she falsify herself on the application? I have that in my lease. If you falsify yourself on the application, you're out.
Well, again, I would say somebody may have gotten the animal since, they may have these concerns. I think. Well, if you have reason to believe that this is not an animal assistant, and you feel confident to, right. If you hear one bark, is that enough? If the dog is constantly barking, again, it gets to be very case by case. If the other tenant says the dog is barking at all hours of the day and night, I can't sleep, that's very different than I heard a bark. You know, if, just be very careful that if you're doing this, it does not appear like you're looking for a reason to get rid of her. Make sure that it's a viable, valid reason that you would apply if it was playing the television too loud at all hours of the day or night. That you're not treating this differently because it's an animal assistant.
I have not researched the intersection of a local code prohibition that would require all dog owners to obtain liability insurance vis-a-vis the Fair Housing Act or any of the similar state codes. No, that's correct. It hasn't been tested yet whether or not Lakewood's outright obligation on all owners and harborers to have liability insurance would be somehow considered a fair housing violation.
I think the law says they do.
Yeah, I mean, the law is it's a blanket obligation.
Well, we have an awful lot of laws in our country and in Lakewood that are based on the behavior. For example, you have to have a driver's license. We walk up to you and say, show me your driver's license on the street? No. You show your driver's license when there's a reason that you need to show it to a police officer who catches you for speeding, whatever it is. That moment in time, that's the moment of truth. Do you have it or don't you? I think in a general rule, when we have a dog that's creating a nuisance, and by the way, this new law creates significant categorization of behavior, nuisance, a dangerous, pre-nuisance, dangerous dog, and vicious dog. And so a dog's behavior can move itself into a variety of categorization. The moment we start getting complaints or have reason to suspect that the behavior of the dogs puts someone at risk or violates our law, we have a right to say, let's look at your insurance at that point in time. Oftentimes, then we're responding to a complaint, and that investigation, the complaint, would give us the opportunity to examine that at that point in time. But the idea is we learned through this dog experience that, you know, the whole premise when we are dealing with breed-specific legislation is that, in fact, all dogs bite, and therefore not just some dogs. And therefore, the idea is if all dogs bite, then all dogs should have insurance. And that's the premise of the law.
I would say that if you apply those rules generally for safety purposes, then yes, what's required for safety for the animal can be applied to an emotional support animal as well.
I mean, I can't give you individual legal advice, but I would suggest that unless your tenant has an outstanding policy of insurance, that would not be sufficient for, if I'm in your shoes, just putting a provision in my lease that the tenant, for example, is going to indemnify me or something in the event that the tenant's dog bites. That's fine, but if the tenant doesn't have any money behind that promise, forget it. It doesn't mean anything. So, yeah, have insurance. I mean, you have insurance anyway. You have liability insurance on your property anyway. Make sure it covers dog bites. Well, I mean, guess what? No one wants to get sued, right? Tom Wasserman just owned his house, and he had a tenant with a dog in it. That's the reason he got sued. That's it. Fortunately, I assume he had a policy of insurance that responded to that lawsuit, provided him a defense. I don't know if it contributed to any settlement. I have no idea, but that lawsuit's now over, and he can move on with his life, I hope. Yeah, good question. I don't think there has been a strong body of law that would suggest that harboring a dog includes just a very temporary overnight stay or something like that, or passing through the city, or there has to be some dominion over the dog in the city, I'd say, for a reasonably measurable period of time, suggest it's living here or staying here for an extended period of time. Dog sitting for, you know what I mean? And I will tell you that in our the exercise of going through the legislating of this new law, we did not very well anticipate that landlords would be considered harborers just by virtue of the fact that their tenants had dogs. But my eyes were open in particular, and the reason I bring this to your attention tonight is because the courts find that landlords harbor animals when those animals are on the common areas of the landlord's property. The grass, the hallways. And so that could be construed to mean that by some law director, by some prosecutor somewhere down the line, that you're a harborer. It wasn't, I don't think, the city's intention to require landlords to have that policy of insurance just by virtue of the fact that their tenants had animals. On the other hand, it's probably good practice anyway, and it's probably, like I say, already in your insurance policy.
Kevin, could you require a tenant to have a dog on a leash the moment they're outside their property, their leasehold? So if they're in a common area, they must be leashed?
As a blanket rule, I'm sure you could, yeah. As a blanket rule, that would be subject to maybe a case-by-case review based on other factors like disabilities, but as a blanket rule, I don't think that there's any problem having that kind of rule regulation in your rules and regs, your lease.
Do you have any precedent on a single-family rental where there's no common space? You know, the whole outside is part of, it's not a two-unit, right? It's just.
Yeah, I mean, I would think under the, well, I have to dig deep in the analysis, but I would say under the court's argument.
If somebody's renting the whole property, it's a single-family rental.
Yeah.
Would you still, would the.
Yeah, I'd say probably then there wouldn't be any landlord harboring. That's at least the argument I'd make if I were making it on on your behalf. Yes.
If I can just personally clear up a couple things here. Right now, I used to rent the dogs, but after talking with my insurance agent, I realized the dog bites that I need to take coming out from me, so I no longer allow dogs. I'm allowed to say that, right? No dogs except unless it's a service, unless it's covered by what you talked about. I also want to make sure I don't like to deal with Section 8 in the government. That just seems like another hassle. Am I allowed to say I'm not allowed to take I do not want Section 8, but if this law passes, I can no longer say that? I just want to make sure that I want to come out of this thing and I want to be responsible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the intention behind Councilman Rader's proposal.
To answer your first question, I'll take the first one. To answer the first question, yes, you can have a no pets policy as long as you know when it doesn't apply.
Right. Now that I do. And I've never been confronted with that. But now that I
I wouldn't say no dogs, I would say no pets. Because if you say no dogs, that literally means no dogs, even a service animal. So no pets, and then that doesn't apply to an animal assistant.
But I could allow cats.
You could. You could.
But not dogs.
You could. As long, well, I guess you can put no, then you should say no dogs other than animal assistant, not service. Remember, the definition is greater than service animals. So if you want to be specific to dogs, I'll allow all pets except dogs you should put in there that you will make an exception for animal assistance. Question two.
Sure. You could not, you could, no. So as it's proposed, as I read it, you would not be allowed to advertise no Section 8. Yes. Yeah.
All right, folks. I hope none of you loses any sleep tonight because you didn't get your question asked and answered. But if you didn't, come up afterward. We're going to adjourn now, let everyone go home. Thank you very much for sticking around. Thanks for attending tonight. Appreciate it. And thanks for all the great questions.